Thank you for letting this Marylander be a part of Oyster South. I know we're right there on the line, but appreciate the Southern hospitality and including me here. As Bill said, I'm here to talk about some work that comprised a component of my dissertation research. So today we'll talk about optimizing desiccation for the purposes of biofouling control within the Chesapeake Bay, Maryland. And so I start out saying, this is in Chesapeake Bay because we know that there are site-specific differences. And so just keep in mind all of this work was done in Chesapeake Bay, quite a bit further north than many of your farms, but hopefully this sheds some light on the utility of desiccation for fouling control. So really briefly, I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the impact of biofouling on oyster farms, right? Why are we worried about it? Why does biofouling matter, and why are we thinking about desiccation? So as most of the folks that are here know, biofouling can impact the growth of oysters. So a number of studies have found reduced growth rates and reduced condition of oysters grown in fouled conditions compared to those grown in non-fouled conditions. We also know that biofouling is a huge headache when it comes to adding weight onto the farm infrastructure, right? So all of the added weight on cages and lines adds to the drag force being applied to lines, clips, anchors, and all of that can necessitate really costly repairs. And it's just more time that you, the farmer, has to spend on husbandry and repairs. And ultimately, biofouling can also impact the economics of your farm. There have been some studies that have found a reduced willingness to pay on the part of the consumer for oysters that have visible biofouling on them. And biofouling can also impact the production cost of your oysters. And so given the, these multitude of challenges that biofouling poses to oyster growers and oyster farm operations, farmers have quite a few tools at their disposals that they use to control fouling, one of which is periodic desiccation or aerial exposure of both the oysters and the cage to control biofouling. These can be applied at a commercial scale using a couple of different culture methods. Two of them are shown here, the flippable floating cage system on the top, and then the adjustable longline systems on the bottom. Both of those can allow desiccation to be employed, not necessarily easily. These still take quite a bit of work, but desiccation can be deployed at a commercial scale using those grow-out systems. So when we think about desiccation, we think about, sorry, I'm going to take this out. So when we think about desiccation, we think about both the frequency or how often we're desiccating. So are you desiccating every week, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, on? And we think about the interval, right, or the duration of each of those desiccation episodes. And so a lot of research has been done on this question of frequency. Much of this took place in the southeastern US and in the Gulf, and I've got images here of some students. So there's Shannon Kirk, Curtis Gamble, and Ellis Chapman, all investigated the effect of weekly, biweekly, monthly desiccation on biofouling on oyster farms. And I'm synthesizing here, but largely those results indicate that weekly desiccation yielded the greatest and the most consistent biofouling reduction on the farm. So great. In some ways, we can consider that question asked and answered. We know weekly desiccation yields the greatest reduction in biofouling. However, this question of interval has received a little bit less attention to date. Most of the studies that have been conducted have employed a 24-hour interval. That is what has become common on oyster farms, and so that's what folks have used. It's relevant to industry. However, because in some of those previous studies that looked at weekly desiccations for 24 hours, in addition to finding biofouling control, they also oftentimes found a growth penalty or reduced growth in those oysters that were desiccated for 24 hours once a week. And so I was curious to see if we could keep the weekly frequency but manipulate the interval. Can we desiccate oysters for a shorter interval of time and find some sweet spot where we can achieve biofouling control without sacrificing growth or added undue stress to the oysters? And so to set this up for you, This work took place, like I said, in the Chesapeake Bay. We're in the Choptank River, which is a tidal tributary of the Chesapeake Bay. Our site's about 9 nautical miles from the confluence with the main stem of the bay. Salinity there is typically between 9 and 11, so I was laughing a little bit earlier when some of the folks in North Carolina were talking about their low salinity, because we would love to see salinities above 15 or 20, but we're typically between 9 and 11. And to set this up, we constructed, so myself with a tremendous amount of help from our facilities staff on campus, we made these automated desiccation hoists. And the reason that I'm focusing on this a little bit here is because we wanted to make these desiccation hoists so that the oysters would kind of enjoy a smooth ride up out of the water for desiccation. Part of the reason there is, you know, if you've worked with oyster grows or flippable floating cages or Australian longline systems, you know that when you turn the cages or you lift the lines, there's a certain degree of jostling that's happening within the bags. And so I know I've always wondered when I'm looking at studies that have found reduced growth in desiccated oysters, I say, is that really just a result of the physical jostling in the bag chipping off the new growth and chipping off the bills? And so we wanted to set this up to avoid that physical jostling so that the desiccation stress is a little bit more intentional and more limited. So set up these automated desiccation hoists and deployed desiccation treatments weekly. So we had a control that experienced no desiccation and then hoists that were desiccated for 4, 8, or 24 hours weekly between May and November. Sampled these monthly for the shell coverage by individual biofouling species. So sampling an oyster and looking at it and saying, okay, what percentage of this is covered by barnacles versus mussels versus macroalgae? We also sampled for worm abundance, so this includes both boring worms, that really problematic Polydora websteri that yields the U-shaped blister, as well as some of the other worms that make their homes just within existing interstitial spaces within the shells. And then also sampled for growth and mortality. So we're going to dive right into results here. What we found was great, by and large, desiccation controlled biofouling. And interestingly, any interval of desiccation was largely effective in controlling biofouling. So here we've got the percent coverage of biofouling on the oyster shell on the y-axis, across the sampling dates on the x-axis, and then the colors of these box and whisker plots indicate the desiccation treatment, and these are going to remain consistent throughout the rest of the plots. So we've got the 0 hour or the control in green, 4 hours in orange, 8 hours in purple, and 24 hours in pink. And what we saw is that there was no difference between the 4, 8, and the 24-hour treatments on all of the sampling dates except for one. So we have this, I don't know if you guys can see this pointer. Yeah? Okay. So on this July 30th sampling date, we do see this kind of stepwise progression in the effectiveness of desiccation intervals where the 24-hour treatment was the most effective, 8 hours a little less, 4 hours a little less. However, by and large, we can say that any of these desiccation treatments led to a substantial reduction in biofouling for the majority of the season. So great, good news. But we're going to dig in a little further into some species-specific results. I know this is a lot of plots on one slide, and folks aren't necessarily close to the screens, but I'll walk you through them. So on the top left, we have a cushion moss bryozoan. On the top center, this is an encrusting bryozoan. Barnacles on the top right, hydroid on the bottom left, Eneromorpha, which is a macroalgae on the bottom center, and dark false mussel on the bottom right. And so what we see is that for most of these species, the 4, 8, and 24-hour treatments performed very similarly, with the notable exception of the cushion moss bryozoan in the top left and the false mussel in the bottom right. These two species are pretty well acclimated to life in the intertidal, and the 4-hour and to some extent the 8-hour treatments were a little bit less effective in controlling those particular species. Moving on to effects of desiccation on worm abundance. So here we have the number of worms per oyster on the y-axis, across the sampling dates on the x. And here, this is a little bit different than the biofouling on the outside of the shell, the epiphytes. Here we saw that only the 24-hour treatment consistently yielded a significant reduction in the number of worms per oyster, so much more variable effects in both the 4 and the 8-hour treatments. And of course, we also have to talk about the effects of desiccation and these intervals on the oysters themselves, right? Up until now, we've been talking about effects on the fowlers, effects on the worms, but we also have to consider what this desiccation stress is doing to your oysters as well. And what we saw is that oysters in the 8 and the 24-hour treatments, in the purple and the pink lines here, they grew less than the oysters that were desiccated for 4 hours per week or those that were not desiccated. And so what does all this mean to a farmer, right? What we've shown here is that we have not found a silver bullet to biofouling control, right? The point was, can we find a sweet spot where we have biofouling control without adding undue stress to the oysters and contributing to reduced growth? And we don't necessarily have that here. And so that requires an evaluation of priorities on the part of the farmer based on the species that are present and the species that are problematic for you, right? So if you're hearing from your buyers or your customers, hey, we love your oysters, love the flavor, love the meat quality, but sometimes when you open up the 100-count box, there's worms coming out of them, or there are mussels, and we're finding that off-putting, then that might indicate that a 24-hour weekly desiccation is the most effective for you. However, it's important to also keep in mind the trade-offs that are associated with that, because it's likely that those oysters will also grow a little bit more slowly. And so this requires you to think about your priorities on your farm and what's right for you. And the other thing that I'll bring up here, and this is a little bit of an aside, but I do think it's important, the logistics of the timing of these desiccation intervals, right? So people have typically deployed a 24-hour weekly desiccation, and I would think that that is in part due to the convenience of being able to motor out to the lease in the morning, flip cages, get on with the rest of your day, and not necessarily have to be tied to being on that lease at some certain interval after that, and after those cages were initially flipped, because you're just gonna go back and flip them the next morning. And so I think it's worth thinking about if you're in a situation where you would have to motor back out to the lease, would an 8-hour or a 4-hour desiccation require a separate boat trip back out, or would you already be on the lease? Because if you wouldn't already still be on the lease after 4 or 8 hours, we have to think about the fuel costs, the labor costs, and the time that are going into that additional trip back out to the lease solely for the purposes of flipping cages. So, like I said, there's not a silver bullet here, but more some data to guide decisions and to help you evaluate the trade-offs that are available to you and that you have to think about in prioritizing biofouling control or growth, while also keeping in mind all of the infrastructure and logistics that go into running a farm. And so with that, I want to leave some time for discussion and questions. So I'd like to thank Maryland Sea Grant and the National Sea Grant Office for funding this work, my advisory committee members, including Bill here, as well as our UMC's facilities staff and students and faculty. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any feedback from you, particularly the growers, about the utility of this kind of data for you.
Am I on? Yeah. Do we have any questions or Jess? There you go. Want the mic? You want it?
My last one. Thank you, Shannon. As you know, we've got gear up there in the chop tank, and we deal every year with that cushion moss. So I'm curious if you could give us some advice as to when it's kind of most intense and how best to deal with it based on the data that you've seen.
Yeah. Thank you, Jess. So yeah, that cushion moss, the Victorella pavida, is really, really problematic. And I think what's really critical with it is to catch it early, right? Because, and this goes for many fouling organisms, if we allow them to establish a foothold, then a single 4-hour weekly desiccation will not control them, right? And so we have to almost start applying those desiccation treatments really before the fouling becomes a problem, right? So it's starting in April, right? We typically will start to see, and again, this is the Chesapeake, so other regions will be different, but for us, we start to see really, really strong colonization by May, but that means that, right, they're colonial bryozoans, so that means that they were colonizing and getting started well before that. So I think it's starting early and then continuing just religiously through October, November, when temperatures start to go down and they kind of go into that hibernacula phase.
Shannon, I'll ask, I don't think you showed any mortality data, but since we just came off of a sudden onset, unusual mortality discussion, what was your observation of how these different intervals affected mortality?
Yeah, good question. And so we actually didn't see any significant differences with respect to mortality among the treatments or compared to the control. And so, you know, there are a couple of ways you can go with that, one of which is desiccation was the only stress that we were physically applying to these oysters. We know that on your farms, you're also engaging in things like tumbling, other aspects of husbandry. And I don't know if Sarah Bodenstein is here. Is she here? No. Well, anyways, another researcher did some work looking at the combined effects of desiccation plus other common farm stressors, including tumbling, and that's where she saw elevated mortality. And so just because mortality was not affected in this case, that doesn't necessarily mean that that will be the case on your farms, because again, you have additional stressors that are happening on those farms, whereas we sought to limit those for the purposes of getting, you know, detailed results in this case.